When my daughter Sarah was only 2, we were crossing over from Jordan, across the West Bank into Israel. Never forget it. Year was 1977. And at that time, you'd cross over the Allenby Bridge. I'm sure many of you here have done that. You'd spend about 2 hours standing in line, and people are restless. Sarah was being held in Margie's arms, and we'd prepared her for a long day. She was a little over 2. And at one point, she just looked around, and of course, the Israeli soldiers are armed to the teeth out there. She didn't know any better. She looked at one of these soldiers and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any bubble gum?" He was stunned. He took off his gun and gave it to a colleague and came over to Margie and put his arms out to Sarah. And she went to him. He took her into a back room. Now I began to get worried. And he came back 5 minutes later with a tray, 3 glasses of lemonade on them. One for little Sarah, one for my wife, one for me. And he waved us over, put us in his Jeep, took us to a taxi stand, and we were on our way through Jericho into Jerusalem. Sarah earned her whole keep in that one question. What is it that disarmed a man like that? What is it that caused a man just for a moment to forget the intensity of his role to keep guard? It was the voice of a little child and the innocence of that little child who had no clue what was really happening. And so when God looks at Rebekah and says to her, 2 nations are in your womb. You see, we live in time which is a punctuated calibration of change for us. But God is unchanging. He lives in the eternal now. We often think we can accelerate the march of history by doing things in a way that probably even ought not to be done. And so when these boys were in the womb and she was told what their destinies were going to be, Rebekah thought she'd give God a hand, and move this thing along a little faster than God had in mind. God works at appointed times, and in those fulfillments of those times, God works and God does his marvelous bidding. So these 2 boys are born, and you can see the difference right from the beginning. One is going to be an outdoorsman, a hunter. The other is sort of going to be a quiet, pensive type of personality. The father was the hunter type, and so he went for Esau as a preferred person in personality, and the mother was looking at Jacob because she had received the word of what the future was going to be like. Ladies and gentlemen, we come as a packaged unit. We cannot be carved up. That's the meaning of the very word individual. We cannot be divided up. We come as composites. We are unique. And when God fashions and frames us in our mother's womb, it is for a distinctive imprint on your life and mine. I sit here and listen to the musicians sing, and I marvel at voices like that. When I finish speaking, people ask me if I've got a cold. No, I haven't. This is a natural Nat King Cole voice that I have, It's always husky. But I listen to music like that and I say, wow, it'd be wonderful, Lord, if you'd given me a little bit of that so that I could wake up every morning and just sing to myself and not get bored with my own voice. Here's what F.W. Borum, one of my favorite essayists, says. Brilliant essay called The Sword of Solomon. May I read for you 3 or 4 paragraphs? F.W. Borum was an Englishman who ministered in Australia and New Zealand, died in the late 50s. He was also the favorite essayist of Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife. She and I often exchanged volumes on Borum's essays. Over 55 volumes of brilliant essays. I think the greatest English essayist that I have read. A man of God who pastored just 3 churches, and one of his books he dedicates to the 3 elect ladies. So beautiful with language. But here it is, the Sword of Solomon. Great was the wisdom of Solomon. For he demonstrated one day more vividly and dramatically than it had ever been demonstrated before the utter unreliability of mathematics on the higher planes of human experience. There is a sense, I suppose, in which twice one are two, a sense in which 2 and 2 are 4, a sense in which many other propositions of this kind are partly, if not wholly, true. It is difficult to see how merchants and accountants and other excellent and well-meaning people could go back to their desks and counting houses if their faith in these arithmetical conclusions was seriously shaken. I hasten to say, therefore, that there is a plane of ledgers and cash books on which these propositions are approximately sound. But if you rise from that plane to a loftier one, you will find at once that they are quite untenable. They simply will not work. Solomon proves it at the city gate once and for all. It may be true that half a sovereign and half a sovereign make one sovereign. It is obviously untrue that half a baby and half a baby make one baby. Let the sword do its deadly work. Let it cleave this baby into 2 parts, and half a baby plus half a baby will represent but the grim and gruesome mockery of a child. 2 halves of a baby make no baby at all. On this higher plane of human sentiment and experience, the laws of mathematics collapse completely. When, for example, a man distributes his wealth among his children, he gives to each a part. But when a woman distributes her love among her children, she gives it all to each of them. I do not believe that any man who has once fallen in love will ever be persuaded that 1 and 1 are only 2. He looks at her and he feels that 1 plus 1 would make 1,000,000. I do not believe that any happy couple, into the sweet shelter of whose home a little child has come, will ever be convinced that 2 and 1 are only 3. Life has been enriched 1,000-fold by the addition of that one little life to theirs, and I'm absolutely certain that no pair from whose clinging and protecting arms their treasure has been snatched will find comfort in the assurance that 1 from 3 leaves 2. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly. I met Margie in 1966. I was only 20. Married her in 72, 6 years later. We've been married now for 43 some years. My life was totally enriched in ways that numbers will not fully express. I know you share the same in the experience of your love, your romance, and the families that you raise. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly.